The more you understand, the heavier the world feels. Truth doesn't just shine a light, it cuts, it eats away, it changes you. To know is to open doors that can never be closed again. And once you cross through, you're never the same. Today, we're stepping into that forbidden zone of thought, from Buddha to Nietzsche, from Freud to Zen, to explore why clarity might be the cruelest curse of all. And by the end, you might realize, ignorance could be the last place peace still lives. Imagine living in a world where everything seems to make sense, where all the answers are already laid out, truths feel absolute, and doubt rarely shows up. There's a strange comfort in that, a calm peace that comes from the illusion of knowing. And then, along comes Socrates. The Athenian philosopher walked the streets and plazas of ancient Greece, challenging citizens, young people, and authorities, not with arrogance, but with questions. Socrates didn't offer ready-made answers. He brought doubt. He pulled the rug out from under those who thought they had it all figured out. And the phrase that echoed through centuries sums up his view on knowledge. I know that I know nothing. That's not just modesty. It's a raw confession of clarity, because by recognizing his own ignorance, Socrates touched something profound. True wisdom begins the moment we stop pretending we already know. But here's the part few dare to explore. That kind of clarity doesn't bring comfort. It brings discomfort, because once you begin to see the world for what it really is, you realize just how many illusions held up your false sense of peace. And that hurts. Socratic wisdom isn't a peaceful achievement. It's a wound that opens. His style of questioning breaks down your certainties. You stop leaning on inherited answers from culture, religion, tradition, and start walking through the dark, guided only by the courage to ask. Have you ever stopped to think how unsettling that can be? Most people live in a kind of philosophical autopilot. They accept ready-made beliefs, hand-me-down values, ideas they never really question. Socrates breaks that cycle. For him, a life unexamined isn't really living at all. His famous line, "The unexamined life is not worth living," from Plato's Apology, isn't just a call to reflection, it's a wake-up call. Living in ignorance may be comfortable, but it's not authentic. And authenticity comes at a cost. Because stepping out of the cave of ignorance, to borrow Plato's image, blinds you at first. And that blinding light is knowledge. Knowledge that reveals not just the world as it is, but you as you are. All your contradictions, fears, and inconsistencies. To know, in that sense, is to strip your soul bare. And that brings deep existential pain. Think of someone who suddenly realizes that everything they believed about themselves was an illusion, or that the moral code they followed blindly is full of contradictions, or that the happiness they've been chasing was built on shallow values. Socratic philosophy takes you right to that breaking point, and like any breaking point, it hurts. So why go through with it? Why choose clarity when ignorance feels so much lighter? Socrates believed that the pain that comes from knowing is the only path to true freedom. Ignorance is a prison. Maybe a comfortable one, but a prison nonetheless. When we start to question, investigate, and deconstruct, we begin breaking those mental chains. The pain of knowing too much is real, but it's what frees us from living a lie. And that freedom takes maturity, because knowing that you know nothing isn't about falling into hopeless doubt. It's about embracing philosophical humility. Socrates didn't want you to be paralyzed by not having answers. He wanted you to be awake, to live with presence, and to understand that wisdom isn't about collecting facts, but learning how to hold space between certainties, with courage and curiosity. Maybe that's why he made people so uncomfortable. Socrates was sentenced to death for corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods of the city. But what he really did was pull people out of their comfortable ignorance and confront them with the unsettling freedom of thought. And not everyone is ready for that. Ignorant happiness is seductive. It's easier to believe that life already has a built-in meaning, that morality is fixed, that justice is clear, that good and evil are black and white. Socrates shatters those safe zones. He shows us that the pursuit of truth isn't a straight road. It's a maze, a path that often starts with pain. But here's the key. It's not the pain of knowing that destroys us. It's our resistance to that pain. Once you understand that discomfort is part of the process, it stops being the enemy and becomes your companion. That existential pain that comes with knowledge is the very soil where awareness grows. It's what makes your life deeper, more honest, more free. Today we're surrounded by information, but not much wisdom. Plenty of people know what to think, but very few know how to think. Socrates didn't hand out answers. He taught us to ask. And asking, at its core, is an act of bravery. The bravery to let go of happy ignorance and accept the discomfort of truth. Make no mistake, that discomfort is real. There will be times you'll wish you hadn't asked, hadn't discovered. You'll feel lost, disillusioned, even paralyzed. But that's the price of clarity. A price that, once paid, changes you forever. To Socrates, knowledge wasn't something you own. It was something you practice. A way of being in the world, with responsibility, with questioning, with presence. And that takes a rare kind of strength. The strength to live with not knowing, without falling into despair. The strength to carry the weight of clarity without letting it crush your soul. Ignorance may seem like a form of happiness, but it's a fragile happiness, one that crumbles the moment awareness touches it. Knowledge, on the other hand, hurts, but it's a pain that heals. Because when you come to know yourself. And when you truly know yourself, you begin to change. That's the true mission of philosophy. Not to protect us from pain, but to prepare us to bear it with dignity and understanding. Socrates knew this. And by drinking the hemlock, he chose truth over the comfort of ignorance. He left us a legacy that still challenges us today. The courage to think. There's a kind of thinking that doesn't comfort, doesn't protect, and offers no easy hope. It doesn't hand out reassuring answers. Instead, it rips off the veil of illusion, takes away our existential crutches, and leaves us standing naked before the abyss. That's the kind of thought Friedrich Nietzsche dared to explore. Few philosophers ever went so deep into the darkness of meaning. While others searched for moral foundations, metaphysical truths, or spiritual consolations, Nietzsche stared straight into the void and never looked away. For him, the search for truth can become a curse. The deeper you go, the more you realize. There is no guaranteed meaning in existence. God is dead, not because he was killed, but because he stopped making sense in a world that no longer believes. And with God gone, so go absolute values, eternal truths, and the promises of salvation. This moment of radical clarity is what Nietzsche called nihilism, when a person realizes the collapse of the values they once stood on. Life loses its why, and all that's left is the how, and that how can be hard, violent, painful. Clarity then becomes an almost unbearable weight. Nietzsche wasn't here to make you feel better. He didn't try to ease existential pain. He faced it head-on. That's why his philosophy is so powerful and also so dangerous, because it demands courage, not the kind you find in self-help books or religious dogma, but the kind that lives deep inside the soul of someone willing to live without guarantees. He once wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." That quote, from Twilight of the Idols, is more than just a powerful phrase. It's a key. Nietzsche knew suffering is part of life. What makes it unbearable is not the pain itself, it's the lack of meaning. Pain without purpose destroys. But when pain has a reason, it can transform us. That's why Nietzsche insisted we must create our own meaning, not wait for it to come from outside, not inherit it blindly from dead traditions. The freedom Nietzsche offers is brutal. You're alone in this world, and it's up to you to give it value. But that kind of freedom comes with a cost, and that cost is the vertigo of the abyss. When you realize the universe has no script, no built-in justice, no promised redemption, you might fall into despair. Nihilism becomes a cliff edge. Many freeze and retreat. Others leap and destroy themselves. Nietzsche wants us to confront that void and rise beyond it, not drown in it. This is where one of his most powerful ideas appears: the Overman, Übermensch. Not a superhero, but a symbol of what we could become. Someone who doesn't just survive the collapse of values, but creates new ones. Someone who affirms life even in the face of suffering, who turns pain into strength, failure into momentum, chaos into creative power. As Nietzsche wrote in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, one must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star. That chaos is life with no illusions. It's the condition of someone who no longer hides behind false hopes, yet still finds reasons to live fully. In this light, nihilism stops being a curse and becomes a passage. Painful, yes, but transformative. Nietzsche wrote much of his work while battling his own pain, physical, psychological, spiritual. But he rejected the idea that suffering should be avoided at all costs. On the contrary, he saw it as a tool for growth, if there's a why, if there's creation, transformation, overcoming. This idea is deeply uncomfortable in a world obsessed with numbing pain through empty entertainment, compulsive consumption, and shallow motivational slogans. Nietzsche challenges this mindset when he says, "It's not a lack of love, but a lack of meaning that makes marriages unhappy." Man is a valuing animal. Without values, he doesn't live. In other words, we don't live on pleasures or certainties. We live on meaning. And when the old meanings die or prove false, we're forced to create new ones. That takes strength, the strength of someone who looks into the abyss and makes it a mirror. But how do you carry that weight? Nietzsche answers with one of his most haunting ideas: the eternal return. The thought that your life, just as it is, will repeat itself forever. Every pain, every joy, every mistake, every win, all of it, again and again, endlessly. The question is brutal. Would you love your life enough to live it again and again forever? If your answer is yes, then you're living fully. If not, something needs to change. The eternal return isn't a physical theory. It's a moral and existential test, a wake-up call, a push to stop living as if you'll get a second chance, or some reward later, and start living as if every moment mattered forever. And that demands cruel honesty, because once you reach that level of awareness, you can't lie to yourself anymore. You can't hide. Clarity, here, is fire. It burns, but it purifies. And the abyss, it's not a fall. It's where your wings begin to grow. Nietzsche wasn't a pessimist. He was a radical realist who believed in the creative force of life. For him, suffering can't be avoided, but it can be given meaning. And in that meaning lies freedom. A freedom that hurts, but also elevates. That tears, but reveals. That pulls you away from the herd and makes you truly human. Clarity is an abyss, yes. But it's in the abyss that the soul finds its depth. Nietzsche invites us to become artists of our own life, to shape our fate with our own hands, not to follow pre-made truths, but to sculpt our own meanings. He reminds us that the path of awareness is lonely, difficult, and dangerous, but it's the only path worthy of a strong spirit. After all, living in illusion is easier, but it's shallow. Living with clarity is heavier, but infinitely more real. Not all knowledge brings light. Sometimes knowing is like opening your eyes in total darkness and seeing more than you ever wanted to. Few philosophers express this so brutally as Arthur Schopenhauer, the German thinker who dared to look at life with complete honesty. No veils, no illusions, no easy hope. For Schopenhauer, suffering isn't an accident of life, it's its constant backdrop. The root of the world isn't reason, goodness, or divine harmony, but something far more unsettling: will. Not the conscious, rational kind that makes decisions, but a blind, irrational, endless force that drives everything from minerals to humans. This force, what he called the will to live, Wille zum Leben, is the basic impulse behind desire, need, struggle, consumption, and the endless cycle of want. And because any will is by nature lack, we are bound to suffering. We want because something is missing. We suffer while we don't have it. And when we get it, boredom strikes, and we want something else. This is the prison of wanting, and it's what keeps the wheel of life turning. As Schopenhauer wrote in The World as Will and Representation, life swings like a pendulum between pain and boredom. It's a harsh diagnosis, and the deeper you understand this structure, the more bitter your view of the world becomes. Schopenhauer doesn't offer comfort, just truth, and his truth is simple and brutal. Suffering is structural, not incidental. The problem isn't this or that obstacle in life. The problem is life itself, driven by continual desire. This leads to the core idea of this lesson. To know is to suffer. For Schopenhauer, knowing means opening your eyes to a tragic reality. Most people live anesthetized, chasing goals, passions, pleasures, believing they'll find happiness there. But if you wake up and see how will works, you realize it's all illusion. In this context, clarity doesn't bring joy, it brings heaviness. Disheartening clarity, realizing once and for all that you're trapped in a machine that can't stop turning, and every turn hurts. Yet it is precisely this awareness that can set you free. By understanding that a blind will dominates us, we begin looking for ways out. One such exit, for Schopenhauer, is the negation of will. That doesn't mean giving up on life. It means actively refusing to be consumed by our endless desires. A kind of existential asceticism, not religious, but internal. A quieting of the self. Here, Schopenhauer's thought converges with Buddhist themes. Just as Buddha described suffering as an essential part of life, Schopenhauer saw liberation as born from letting go of desire. He even said that if he'd known Buddhism earlier, he'd have saved years of philosophical work. Both traditions agree. Desire is the root of suffering, and wisdom lies in overcoming it. But this isn't easy. It demands profound introspection, inner discipline, and an almost artistic stance toward life. And here, Schopenhauer offers another temporary escape: art. To him, art is one of the few human activities that can suspend the will, even for a moment. When completely absorbed in a symphony, a painting, or a landscape, when you desire nothing and simply contemplate, that's when suffering stops, even if just temporarily. Art, then, becomes a kind of aesthetic redemption. Not because it changes the world, but because it removes us from it, even if only briefly. For Schopenhauer, the artistic genius is someone who detaches from the will and perceives the essence of the world in pure form, seeing it not as something to use, but something to behold. This point is essential to understanding the depth of his philosophy. Though his diagnosis is tragic, he doesn't succumb to despair. There's a way out, but it requires renunciation. It demands facing your reality head-on. You must accept that the price of knowledge is suffering, but that suffering can be purifying. In modern philosophy, many call Schopenhauer a pessimist, and he is, but not in any cheap sense. His pessimism isn't empty lamentation, it's relentless clarity. He doesn't want you to cry, he wants you to awaken, to see how cruel the will's game is, and to stop playing. Think about everyday life. How often do we delude ourselves into thinking, once that happens, then I'll be happy? And when it happens, that promised happiness fades, and we're chasing something else. This cycle is exposed by Schopenhauer. That's why knowing hurts, because he tears down our easy hopes. He strips away the rosy veils we drape over existence. He destroys the modern ideal that life must climb toward personal fulfillment. For him, that pursuit is the trap. The more we want happiness, the more unhappy we become, because we want too much. But nowhere in his work does he despise life. Instead, he calls for maturity. for accepting pain as an inescapable part of existing, for cultivating an inner calm born from renouncing control, desire, ego. To know is to suffer, but it's also the first step to conquer suffering. Schopenhauer offers a philosophical path to liberation, not one that promises fame or glory, only inner peace, the silencing of the will, contemplation of beauty, and compassion for all who suffer. For when we understand that suffering is universal, rooted in existence itself, we awaken to empathy, to a quiet tenderness born from understanding. So, to know is to suffer, but it's also to understand, forgive, and care for ourselves and for others. Here, truth isn't a tool for power. It's a burden that, when carried with dignity, transforms into wisdom. And that is Schopenhauer's greatest teaching. Life hurts, and the more you understand, the more it hurts. But that pain is a gateway to a life deeper, truer, and more peaceful. Think you really know yourself? That your choices come from reason? That your desires are conscious and your behaviors rational? Sigmund Freud shattered that comforting belief. The father of psychoanalysis revealed that, far from being masters of ourselves, we operate under the sway of internal forces we often don't even realize exist. The ego is not master in its own house. This claim is more than provocative. It's devastating. It exposes a hidden mental underworld inside each of us, repressed memories, forbidden impulses, buried desires, unresolved traumas, a shadowy realm called the unconscious. Getting to know that unconscious is a journey as transformative as it is painful. Most of us prefer to believe we're autonomous, making decisions, choosing, loving, rejecting, suffering, all based on conscious thinking. But for Freud, consciousness is just the tip of the iceberg. The majority of who we are lies submerged, influencing our behaviors, relationships, dreams, and our suffering. This is the core disturbance psychoanalysis introduces to modern thought. You're not who you think you are, and even more, you lie to yourself all the time to keep the illusion going. Our unconscious is not merely silent, it's active. It shapes habits, triggers symptoms, sabotages plans, repeats suffering. It's as if a hidden script, written by old wounds, childhood experiences, moral censorship, and unadmitted desires, is running our lives from behind the scenes. Freud knew that facing this material is painful, because the unconscious doesn't respect logic or moral norms. It's chaotic, symbolic, contradictory. Bringing it to light forces us to confront truths we'd rather keep buried, desiring someone we shouldn't, resenting someone we ought to love, fearing we're exactly what we're trying to hide. At that moment, knowledge becomes deeply unsettling. Psychic truth isn't comforting, it disorients. It demands we reinterpret our personal history. It forces us to dismantle the narratives made for our own protection, and that hurts even more. As Freud said, the symptom is a repressed truth that refuses to disappear. It comes back, distorted, as anxiety, compulsion, insomnia, phobia, or repetitive failure. In psychoanalysis, knowing yourself isn't discovering something you already know. It's opening a door to a basement where you've locked away parts of yourself. And those parts aren't quiet. They scream, they act, they resist. Until you listen. That's why the analytical process can be so painful. Because it forces you to drop your idealized self-image and accept that you're full of contradictions, ambiguity, and internal conflict. Love and destruction, purity and perversity, light and shadow all coexist within you. Freud introduced the idea of psychic conflict. He showed our mind is a battlefield between three parts: the id, primitive impulses, the ego, the mediator, and the superego, moral demands. This conflict has no final resolution. It's structural. To live is to sustain that tension, and that inevitably brings suffering. But that suffering can be worked through. It can become understanding, autonomy, real relief. Freud saw self-knowledge not as light or pleasurable, but an act of courage, because it means facing what's behind your ideal self mask. One of Freud's most revealing gateways to the unconscious was the dream. He called it the royal road to the unconscious. In dreams, repressed desires emerge disguised. The analyst's role is to decipher symbols, interpret slips of the tongue, missed acts, repetitions, all pointing to truths the person can't say, but that the body and language can't conceal. And when that truth surfaces, it's unsettling, but also liberating. Freud believed real psychic health only comes when you can make sense of suffering, when trauma is brought into consciousness and symbolically processed, when you stop running from the pain and start listening. This path is hard, often lonely. Facing the unconscious isn't a collective movement or a cozy journey. It's intimate, unpredictable, and requires time. But those brave enough to walk discover a freedom born not of escaping pain, but of facing it. This doesn't mean psychoanalysis promises quick fixes. Freud was skeptical of easy solutions. Psychoanalysis does not promise happiness. It promises to make suffering understandable. And that understanding, even if painful, is the first step to transforming suffering. Because what destroys us isn't pain itself. It's not knowing where it comes from. Once you see that your anxiety, compulsion, or melancholy has unconscious roots, you stop feeling like a victim of chance and step into the authorial role of your own story. And though unsettling, that is empowering. Freud knew many would choose psychic ignorance. It's easier to blame others, society, or fate. But for him, true emotional maturity starts when you own your unconscious, not as guilt, but as care. This is psychoanalysis's radical offer, to become the author of your own desire, to know what you truly want, not what someone else imposed on you. And that can be deeply uncomfortable. Often the thing you thought you wanted was never really yours. Freud's journey is a descent into the deepest layers of the psyche. And like any meaningful descent, it runs through darkness, fear, and disorientation. But only the truly courageous emerge with real awareness. Self-knowledge for Freud isn't philosophical luxury. It's vital, urgent, because the more we ignore our unconscious, the more it acts through us, and often destroys us without our awareness. So yes, unconscious knowledge is disturbing, but it's also our pathway back to wholeness, truth, and freedom. And maybe that's Freud's greatest lesson. Choose the uncomfortable truth over the comforting illusion. Because only the truth can free you from blind repetition and let you live authentically. Freedom. It sounds beautiful, inspiring. We often use it to mean autonomy, dignity, possibility, but Jean-Paul Sartre forces us to see it in a much rawer, more radical, and yes, far more unsettling light. Because for Sartre, being free isn't a cozy blessing, it's a condemnation. This isn't political or legal freedom, it's ontological freedom, existential freedom at the core of our being. We're free because there's no preset blueprint for us, no instruction manual that tells us who we must be. Existence precedes essence. This famous line from Existentialism is a Humanism is the cornerstone of Sartre's thought. It means that humans exist first. We are born, we live, we act, and only later define ourselves by our choices. There's no fixed human nature, no preset destiny. You are simply what you make of yourself. This kind of freedom, taken seriously, is dizzying. If nothing defines us, then everything depends on us. And if everything depends on us, then we're fully responsible for our choices. You can't ultimately blame God, luck, genetics, society, or other people. According to Sartre, we are condemned to be free. This phrase, condemned to be free, is one of the most disturbing in modern philosophy. Why is something usually seen as positive described as a condemnation? Because full freedom comes with no guarantees. It doesn't come with meaning handed to us, absolute morals, or a clear direction. Instead, it puts you at the center of your own life. as the only possible author of your destiny, and that total responsibility is crushing. This is what brings about what Sartre calls existential anguish. Anguish is not fear. Fear is about something concrete, external. Anguish is the emptiness at the heart of radical choice. It's the panic that at any moment you could choose differently, that nothing, except your own decision, prevents you from being or doing something else. In Being and Nothingness, Sartre gives the image of someone standing at the edge of a cliff. What terrifies the person isn't the abyss itself, but that nothing prevents them from jumping. That nothing is freedom. Absolute freedom with no safety net. And that terrifying possibility plunges us into anguish. So what do many people do when faced with that? They run away. Sartre called this bad faith, mauvaise foi. Bad faith is self-deception, the attempt to escape freedom by pretending it doesn't exist. When someone says, "I don't have a choice," or "I am the way I am because I was raised that way," or "I'm just following orders," these are all ways to deny personal responsibility. But it's all an illusion. Even saying "I didn't choose" is itself a choice, not choosing. That in itself is a choice. That's why, for Sartre, there is no fixed essence, only existence in action. We continually construct ourselves through what we do, decide, reject, or accept. And that construction never ends. We are always unfinished, always in process, always free, and therefore always vulnerable to anguish. But it's not all despair. Sartre wasn't a nihilist. He didn't say life is meaningless. He said meaning isn't given. It must be created by you in each moment. And there freedom turns from curse to gift. Because if nothing defines us from the start, we're free to invent who we'll be. We can change. We can break patterns. We can create new values, unique projects, personal paths. Sartre believed that even in a world without God, without absolute truths, without a preset purpose, humans could assert themselves as conscious, ethical creators. But attention, this kind of ethics isn't found in manuals. It emerges from radical responsibility toward others. By choosing one way of life, you're implying that way is valid for humanity. That's why for Sartre, choosing is always a moral act. You can't escape the ethical weight of existence. We are free, but we're not alone. Others reflect us back, challenge us, hold us accountable. In his play No Exit, he famously wrote, "Hell is other people." But that line is often misunderstood. Sartre wasn't saying people are unbearable. He meant that the gaze of others reveals us. Through others, we can no longer lie to ourselves. They reflect a mirror we don't control. And that confronts us with our own freedom and its consequences. So freedom is always dialogical. There's no authentic freedom without responsibility for how our choices affect others. And that responsibility isn't light. It exposes. It demands awareness. That's why Sartre insisted humans are condemned to be free, not because freedom is bad, but because it's unavoidable. Even when we refuse to choose, we still choose. Even when we refuse to act, we're deciding. This vision has powerful existential weight. It asks us for courage. Courage to let go of excuses. Courage to own our decisions. Courage to live without absolute certainty. Courage to create meaning where there is none. Freedom is grueling, painful, anguishing, but it's also dignifying. Because only someone truly free can be authentic. Only someone who claims their existence can live in truth. Sartre did not want us to be heroes. He wanted us to be conscious. He wanted us to stop lying to ourselves, blaming others, coasting through life. He believed life is worth living only when it's fully taken on, with all its contradictions, its gaps, its risks. It's a profound call to responsibility, a constant reminder that to be free is to carry your world on your shoulders. And while that can hurt, there's no real greatness without that weight. Most people spend their lives running away from pain. We try to avoid it, numb it, deny it, make distractions or comforts so it'll forget about us. But Buddha did the opposite. He stopped. He became quiet. He looked directly at suffering and said, "Life is dukkha." This is the first noble truth. And although we often translate dukkha simply as suffering, it's deeper than that. It refers not just to emotional or physical pain, but the fundamental discomfort of existence, a continuous misalignment, a silent dissatisfaction woven through every human experience. Buddha didn't arrive at this through logical reasoning. He discovered it through direct experience. A protected prince surrounded by luxury, when he finally left the palace, he saw disease, aging, death for the first time. That shook him deeply. In seeing impermanence in its rawest form, he realized, nothing we chase can bring true peace. Everything changes, everything passes. From that shock was born his spiritual journey. That first noble truth is the foundation. Life, the way we live it, is marked by frustration, pain, and transience. Understanding that is not about falling into pessimism or saying everything is negative. It's about recognizing that pleasure is fleeting. Every attachment carries the risk of loss, and every fulfilled desire brings with it the seeds of another, and therefore, another frustration. The more aware you become of this, the more pain you experience. But you also suffer with clarity. Suffering that's ignored repeats itself. Suffering that's denied evolves into attachment, compulsion, and fear. But suffering that's understood becomes a path. That's the great shift in Buddha's teaching. Not escaping pain, but going through it with wisdom. Dukkha comes in many forms. It's the emptiness you feel even when surrounded by things. The anxiety of losing someone you love. The constant attempt to hold on to time. The endless desire for more. Aging, sickness, death, and the knowledge deep down that it's all waiting for us. But rather than letting that paralyze us, Buddha asks us to face it with presence and compassion. In Buddhism, suffering is not punishment, injustice, or a mistake. It's part of being alive, having a body, a mind, an identity in constant change. This constant change is impermanence, another key concept. Nothing stays the same. No feeling, no relationship, no state of mind. Everything flows. Yet our minds, clinging to control, try to fix what is fluid. We try to hold on to pleasure, avoid pain, keep things unchanged, and this inevitably causes more suffering. That's why understanding impermanence is both painful and freeing. When you clearly see that nothing is permanent, that everything changes, that no one stays the same for even a moment, your foundation shakes. But you also break free from the illusion of permanence. The pain comes from realizing nothing lasts. Not joy, not suffering, not even the self. Yet that realization is also the starting point of liberation. Liberation from what? Attachment, the deepest root of suffering according to Buddha. Attachment isn't love. It's the attempt to control, to cling, to possess. We love, and then we fear we can't control whether the loved one stays. We try to preserve youth, health, joy, as if we could hold life still. But that's an illusion, and when we live from that illusion, we only deepen our suffering. The more we see this, the more we realize it's not just what happens that hurts, but how we relate to what happens. Pain is unavoidable, but suffering, the mental and emotional resistance to life's flow, can change. And that transformation begins with deeply recognizing dukkha. This is a truth that takes courage. Because we live in a culture that idolizes pleasure, consumption, success, and always feeling good, admitting that life includes suffering sounds weak. But for Buddha, it's the first step toward wisdom. Wisdom here isn't just about accumulating knowledge, it's about seeing clearly. It's realizing that our mental world, with its expectations, demands, and fears, constantly fuels dissatisfaction. And once you see that, you can change how you relate to reality. That's why Buddha doesn't stop at pointing out suffering. He shows us a path forward. After the first noble truth, dukkha, come the second, the cause of suffering, attachment. The third, the possibility of ending suffering, and the fourth, the path to that, the noble eightfold path. This includes right understanding, seeing things as they are, right intention, cultivating compassion and detachment, right speech, avoiding harmful or confusing words, right action, living ethically, right livelihood, sustaining yourself without harming others, right effort, developing healthy mental states, right mindfulness, being present in each moment, right concentration, cultivating deep meditative states. This isn't a path of denial, it's one of lucid presence, a path that recognizes suffering without being overwhelmed by it. That transforms pain into compassion. That gives up illusions without falling into despair. That finds peace not by avoiding life, but by diving into it with clarity. Understand that this peace isn't euphoria. It's not the absence of problems. It's an internal state of deep acceptance of reality as it is, with all joys, losses, and impermanence. Buddha didn't promise easy happiness. He offered freedom from illusions. And that freedom, though painful at first, leads to a genuine lightness. A lightness born of understanding. Everything changes. Everything passes. I too. That truth may seem sad, but for someone who truly grasps it, it becomes freedom. Because when we let go of resisting what is, we begin to flow with life, and paradoxically, suffer less. So, understanding means perceiving suffering, but also perceiving a way through it, a path of wisdom, compassion, and presence. That's Buddha's invitation, to see pain with open eyes, and by doing so, begin to transform it. There is a kind of wisdom that makes no noise. It doesn't take the stage, it doesn't argue, it watches, it stays quiet, it flows with the unseen currents of the universe. This is the wisdom of the Tao, the natural, mysterious way taught by Lao Tzu, the legendary Chinese master and author of the Tao Te Ching. But don't be fooled into thinking this wisdom brings only peace. For Lao Tzu, clarity can also bring suffering. The more someone understands the Tao, the deep, impersonal order that holds the cosmos, the more they see how out of alignment the world is, and especially how people are caught by ego, desire, illusion. So the sage suffers, not for themselves, but for the world. This silent sorrow isn't complaining. It's quiet, compassionate sadness, the pain of seeing too much. Lao Tzu invites us to release the ego, not the psychoanalytic kind, but the ego that believes in separation, control, and importance. He said, "Knowing others is intelligence. Knowing yourself is true wisdom. Controlling others is strength. Controlling yourself is true power." Following the Tao means letting go, giving up the need to control, dominate, or constantly assert oneself. You must surrender to life's flow, like water adjusting to any shape without losing its essence. That surrender runs counter to what society praises: ambition, competition, status. That's why the wise suffer. They see that the more the world drifts from the Tao, the more confusion, violence, and anxiety grow. People want status, control, possessions. They try to dominate the uncontrollable. It all grows from an inflated, fragile ego. Yet that ego is an illusion. It tries to freeze what must change: identity, feelings, relationships. And the harder we cling, the farther we move from the Tao and from peace. The wise, seeing this clearly, don't enforce their view. They don't try to fix the world by force, because they know true wisdom is humble, not militant. Lao Tzu said, "The wise do not collect. The more they help others, the richer they become. The more they give, the more complete they are." That silent surrender isn't passivity, it's egoless action. It's what Taoism calls wu wei, acting without force, doing without imposing. It's trusting that the universe has its own rhythm. When we try to control it, we throw it off balance. But to reach that state, we must let go of attachment to opinions, certainty, or recognition. And letting go hurts, because the ego yells to be heard, acknowledged, remembered. Letting the ego go is like dying while alive, but then being reborn with a heart ready for what is. In Taoism, that emptiness isn't loss, it's potential. It's the space where everything can happen. It's where the wise reside. But it's a lonely place. Few endure the quiet there. Most choose the noise of opinions, social media, conflict, even if it keeps them disconnected from essence. Lao Tzu understood this solitude. It's said, he left imperial China to live in the mountains, fatigued by corruption and disorder. Legend says he wrote the Tao Te Ching as a final gift to the world, a guide for anyone wanting to return to simplicity, nature, and truth. He knew wisdom isn't popular. It doesn't attract crowds. It demands silence in a noise-worshipping world. It calls for humility during an era of bloated egos. It invites contemplation in a society driven by speed and consumption. So the wise suffer, seeing how much humanity has forgotten itself, forgotten that everything has a rhythm, a season, a moment. Trees don't rush growth, rivers don't fight gravity, animals don't seek glory, they just live. Everything in the universe flows with the Tao, except humans, and that imbalance causes suffering. Modern life is a non-stop attempt to manipulate nature, control time, prove value. But that only pulls us away from the Tao and closer to frustration, fear, internal chaos. The wise see this, and they suffer, not out of pride, but because they've been there. Because they know suffering stems from forgetting the flow, from overlooking that what we seek is really in letting go. Lao Tzu said, "Those who know don't speak. Those who speak don't know." That line is both invitation and warning. It invites inward listening and warns against the arrogance of ego that must always prove itself. So the wise stay silent, but their silence speaks volumes. They act with gentleness, live simply, move with ease. Their suffering doesn't harden them, it makes them compassionate. They don't try to change the world by force, but shift it with balanced presence. That's the subtle beauty of Taoist wisdom. It doesn't need to be seen to be real, and that's why it hurts. Because in a world that worships what's visible, measurable, loud, subtle wisdom gets ignored. The wise live like exiles, not outside the world, but at odds with its values. Yet they continue, not out of stubbornness, but fidelity to the Tao. They know everything returns to balance, even if slowly. And in that silent knowing, there's deep peace. So the pain of the wise isn't despair, it's clarity. Clarity in the face of the human ego, twisting the world. Clarity facing disarray, born from disconnect with essence. Clarity ingesting solitude, inevitable for those who glimpse what few do, but it's clarity fused with compassion. Because the ego eventually runs dry. Disorder eventually dissolves. Excess eventually returns to center. And that center is where the wise dwell. Silent, solitary, serene. Not because they fled the world, but because they understand its flow. There's a place inside you where everything is repressed, denied, hidden, or deemed unacceptable lives. That dark, uncomfortable, and often ignored place is what Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung called the shadow. Facing the shadow is one of the most challenging and necessary tasks in the journey of self-knowledge. And the more you truly get to know yourself, the closer you get to it, and the more terrifying it can seem. Jung said that individuation, the process of becoming who you really are, can only happen when we integrate the shadow. In other words, when we stop rejecting the darker sides of our psyche and begin to recognize them as part of ourselves, not to justify or feed them, but so we don't end up being unconsciously controlled by them. The shadow, according to Jung, is everything the ego, the conscious I, prefers not to see. Its repressed desires, unspoken anger, aggressive impulses, insecurities, prejudice, trauma, fears, unspeakable fantasies. But it also contains positive aspects, like neglected talents and inner strengths that got buried under self-sabotage or social pressure. It's important to understand the shadow is not the evil in us. It's simply everything we've pushed out of conscious awareness. And precisely because of that, it holds enormous power. What's unacknowledged works behind the scenes. How many times do we react strongly to something we barely understand? How often do we project onto others what is actually ours? The shadow shows up in harsh judgments, automatic behavior, emotional outbursts, and unconscious patterns. It hides in the small gestures of daily life. And when unseen, it takes control. Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." That sentence sums up the urgency of facing the shadow. As long as it stays hidden, we live at the mercy of inner forces we blame on luck, other people, or fate. But when we bring it into awareness, we gain freedom, and with it, responsibility. But that process isn't painless. Looking at the shadow takes psychological courage. It's like going down into the basement of the soul and turning on the lights, knowing full well that what you find might scare you, because we're not used to thinking that what we most condemn in others also exists within us. Jung called this projection the tendency to see in others the parts of our shadow we don't recognize in ourselves. For example, someone who rejects their own anger might be overly sensitive to the anger of others, reacting with fury or disgust. Not because the other person is truly aggressive, but because something inside has been projected outward, and until that projection is withdrawn, the conflict remains. Integrating the shadow means accepting that we're not purely good, ethical, conscious, or rational beings. We also carry chaos, contradiction, and instinct within us. Denying that only deepens the inner split. Jung didn't believe in suppressing the shadow, but in integrating it into the self, the wholeness of who we are. He called this process individuation, the path of becoming whole, not perfect, but complete, not morally flawless, but aware of the full range of forces in the psyche. In practice, this means coming into contact with our deepest inner conflicts. It means asking questions like, what parts of myself do I try to hide? What really triggers me in other people? And why? What do I fear feeling so much that I pretend it doesn't exist in me? These questions take us inward. And contrary to what some think, the individuation process isn't some instant spiritual awakening. Often, it's a painful dive into the unconscious, a confrontation with the darkest, most ambiguous parts of ourselves. Jung drew from myths, alchemy, and symbolic religions to describe this journey. For him, spiritual traditions are full of metaphors for the psychological process. Facing the shadow, for instance, is like fighting the dragon in fairy tales, or descending into the underworld, like Orpheus in Greek mythology. It's a crossing, an inner rite of passage, and like any rite, it brings transformation. But there is no transformation without pain, because letting go of the ideal image we've built of ourselves, that socially acceptable persona, is a kind of symbolic death. The death of the inflated ego, the fall of the mask. And it hurts. It shakes everything. It can even lead to crisis, but crisis that clears the way for truth. Jung believed that human beings must confront their shadow, or be consumed by it. And this applies not just to individuals, but to entire societies. He argued that many horrors of the 20th century were the result of collective shadow projection. Entire cultures rejecting their own destructive impulses and projecting them onto perceived enemies. In other words, what isn't integrated in the personal psyche spills out into culture. That's why Jung saw self-knowledge not just as therapy, but as an ethical and political act. A person who recognizes their shadow is less likely to project it onto others. They become more humble, more responsible, more aware. But that awareness comes at a cost. Deep self-knowledge takes us away from comfortable illusions. We can no longer hide behind the image of being the good guy or the eternal victim. We realize we're made of light and darkness, that we have the power to create and to destroy, that we can love and hurt the same people. That kind of truth hurts, but it also heals, because once we accept it, we stop living fragmented lives. we become whole. Jung wrote, "The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. To become conscious of it involves recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. This act is the essential condition for any kind of self-knowledge. The shadow, then, is not an enemy. It's an invitation, a mirror, a doorway. To look at it is to say yes to the full spectrum of your inner life. It's to accept that good and evil, light and dark, order and chaos, all live in the same place, the human soul. Facing it is an act of courage and of self-love, because we can only truly love what we fully know." Albert Camus wasn't a philosopher in the traditional sense. He was a writer of existence, a thinker who explored the human experience in its rawest, most naked, most tragic form. For him, the central philosophical question wasn't about being, truth, or essence. It was about suicide. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide, the myth of Sisyphus. This isn't a dramatic statement, it's radically honest, because it starts from the core of the human condition, the tension between our deep need for meaning and the silence of the universe. We want life to have a purpose, for pain to have a reason, for suffering to lead to redemption. But the universe remains silent. This friction between the human hunger for meaning and the mute indifference of the world is what Camus calls the absurd. The absurd isn't in the world or in us, it's in the relationship between the two. It appears when we become fully conscious of our condition and realize that no matter how much we long for meaning, there simply isn't any given to us. This realization tears reason apart, because for centuries, reason was our tool for creating order. We used it to build systems, doctrines, religions, utopias. But in the face of the absurd, reason collapses. No logical explanation can justify senseless pain, premature death, or innocent suffering. Camus writes, "The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world." The myth of Sisyphus. It's a devastating encounter because it offers no relief. It doesn't say everything will be okay. On the contrary, it suggests that maybe nothing makes sense and that this is an inescapable truth. So what can we do with this? According to Camus, most people try to deny the absurd. Some turn to religion, hoping for a transcendent meaning. Others drown in distractions, overwork, or easy pleasures. But all of these are forms of escape, attempts to cover up the painful truth. Camus rejects this escape. For him, it's not about denying the absurd, it's about facing it. And that leads to the heart of his philosophy, revolt. Awareness of the absurd doesn't have to lead to suicide or nihilism. It can lead to rebellion, a quiet, everyday, intimate rebellion. The rebellion of someone who knows life has no inherent meaning and chooses to live it anyway. What is a rebel? A man who says no, but refuses to be silent. The rebel. For Camus, revolt is the most noble act of human consciousness. It's the cry of someone who sees the emptiness and, instead of surrendering, affirms life with dignity. Revolt is an ethical choice to live without illusions, but also without giving up. This attitude isn't easy. It takes courage. Because to live in the light of the absurd is to live without guarantees. No promises, no final rewards. And that demands an inner strength that many find hard to cultivate. The world prefers comforting lies to painful truths. But Camus doesn't. He gives us a mythic image to represent this condition: Sisyphus. In Greek mythology, Sisyphus was condemned by the gods to roll a giant boulder up a hill for eternity, only to watch it fall back down each time, a punishment that seems meaningless. But Camus reinterpreted this myth as the perfect image of a conscious human being. Life is pushing the boulder, knowing it will fall. To know this and still push it is the ultimate act of revolt, because it means choosing to live without illusions, without surrender, without seeking redemption. And Camus ends his essay by saying, "We must imagine Sisyphus happy." This phrase, as enigmatic as it is powerful, is not a call for resignation, but a call for freedom. Because only someone who doesn't need a meaning imposed from the outside is truly free. The absurd man is the one who invents his own values, finds beauty in the void, and loves the world even knowing it doesn't love him back. It's a philosophy of clarity, and like all clarity, it hurts. The more we become aware of the absurd, the more we feel the weight of existing. False hopes vanish, easy comforts dissolve, future promises fade. All that's left is the present, the moment, the now, in all its fragility. But it's in that fragility that Camus finds human greatness. He writes, "There is no fate that cannot be surmounted by scorn." Here, scorn doesn't mean arrogance. It means a kind of internal freedom, the ability to not bow down before the absurd, to look it in the eye and keep going. That's the power of awareness, even if it hurts, even if it shatters reason, even if it puts us face to face with nothingness. It's still the only solid ground for living authentically. To live in the light of the absurd is to live in tension. There is no rest, no ready-made meaning. But there is freedom, and there is dignity. Camus doesn't offer comfort, he offers courage. Courage to keep living even without a why. Courage to create beauty where there's no promise. Courage to love the world even knowing it won't love you back. And that's why, unlike Sartre, Camus doesn't think we need to invent some made-up meaning for life. For him, life has no meaning, and that's okay. What we need is to become aware of that lack and choose to live fully anyway. It's a philosophy of stone, sun, and dust, a philosophy with no heaven, but with solid ground, a philosophy that recognizes the pain of being alive and still celebrates the integrity of choosing to live. The awareness of the absurd does tear us apart, but it also awakens us. It awakens us to the freedom that comes when we no longer need guarantees. It awakens us to the beauty that exists, even in the fleeting. It awakens us to the quiet nobility of the one who, even when facing the void, still chooses to say yes. We grow up learning that knowledge sets us free, that it brings light, growth, and transformation. But what if knowledge is also used to control? What if the truths we're taught are filled with hidden interests, surveillance, and systems of domination? That's the central challenge posed by Michel Foucault, one of the most provocative and disruptive philosophers of the 20th century. His ideas force us to question not just institutions, but also the truths they claim to teach us. Because for Foucault, knowledge is power. And all power, in some way, is also oppression. Unlike what many people think, power doesn't just come from above, from authoritarian governments, the police, or abusive bosses. According to Foucault, power is everywhere. It flows through schools, hospitals, prisons, families, conversations, even the way we look at each other. And the most unsettling part? Power often hides behind care, science, or truth. Foucault shows us that knowledge is never neutral. It's never just information. It's always tied to power. When a society decides what's normal and what's deviant, it's not just describing reality, it's shaping behavior, controlling bodies, and setting limits on what can and can't exist. There is no power relation without the correlative constitution of a field of knowledge, nor any knowledge that does not presuppose and constitute, at the same time, power relations, discipline and punish. That quote gets to the heart of his critique. Knowledge and power are always linked. Every truth claim already carries a form of control. That's why real awareness isn't comfortable. It's an act of resistance. One of Foucault's most famous examples is his study of prisons. In Discipline and Punish, he explains how we moved from physical punishment, like public torture, to more civilized systems of discipline, surveillance, and normalization. But what seems like progress, replacing torture with rehabilitation, is actually just a shift in power strategy. Modern power doesn't need to hurt your body. It shapes your mind. It teaches you to monitor yourself constantly. The prison becomes internal. Control no longer comes from the outside. It becomes part of how we see ourselves. This is what Foucault calls the disciplinary society, a world where control doesn't come from brute force, but from constant observation, testing, comparison. The panopticon, a prison where inmates never know if they're being watched, so they act as if they are, becomes a symbol of modern life. And here's the disturbing part. The more refined our knowledge becomes, the more subtle the control gets. Psychology, medicine, education, criminology. These fields all produce knowledge that shape how we live. They tell us what's normal, what's healthy, what's acceptable. And those who don't fit are silenced, medicated, excluded. Not because they're doing anything wrong, but because they fall outside the norm. Foucault isn't saying these sciences are fake. He's saying that all knowledge has political effects. It defines what can be said, what can be done, what can be imagined. And in doing so, it also decides who gets to speak and who stays silent. That's why Foucault shifts the question from, is this true, to something far more powerful. Who gets to say what is true? It's a radical change. It pushes us to stop blindly chasing correct knowledge and start looking behind the scenes, to ask who's producing it, for what purpose, and with what consequences. In this context, awareness isn't a reward, it's a burden. Because to see how knowledge and power are entangled means letting go of our illusions. It means realizing that things we take as natural, like gender, behavior, identity, social norms, are often historical inventions used to control people. So awareness becomes a form of resistance, and that resistance begins in thought. Foucault doesn't give us clear answers. He breaks things apart. He dismantles solid truths. He shows us that history isn't linear, progress isn't always freedom, and knowledge can be used to dominate just as easily as to liberate. He pulls the ground from beneath our feet, so we can build something new. That rebuilding starts when we see ideas as practices, when we stop asking just, is this right or wrong? And begin asking, where does this idea come from? Who benefits from it? Who does it leave out? What does it make invisible? These questions open the door to a new kind of ethics, an ethics of attention, of listening, of healthy doubt. Because understanding knowledge as power also means realizing we can and should challenge that power. We can create new narratives, amplify silenced voices, make space for different truths. But doing that is exhausting, because thinking this way doesn't let us rest in easy answers. It forces constant reflection, inner vigilance. It makes us realize how often we participate in systems of oppression without even noticing. How we sometimes use knowledge to rank, to silence, to dominate. That's why awareness is a political act. And more than that, it's a risk. Foucault was a thinker who embraced risk. He knew that thinking deeply means facing resistance, breaking with what's comfortable, and upsetting the status quo. But he also knew that without that discomfort, freedom is impossible, because power thrives in silence. And the most dangerous silence is the one dressed as absolute truth. That's why, for Foucault, to think is to resist the obvious, the given, the it's always been this way. To resist the urge to accept injustice as natural. To resist repeating ideas without questioning them. Thinking, then, becomes an act of courage, because when you truly think, you stop fitting in, you stop being predictable, you stop serving the systems that want obedient minds and controlled bodies. In the end, Foucault doesn't teach us what to think. He teaches us to question what we already think, to doubt what seems neutral, to hear what's been silenced, to imagine what we've been told is impossible. And in that act, lonely, uncomfortable, but deeply freeing, awareness becomes a form of resistance. In a world where we crave quick answers, simple explanations, and absolute truths, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel comes in like a philosophical storm. His thinking offers no shortcuts. It doesn't aim to comfort. On the contrary, it dives headfirst into the chaos of reality to show that real knowledge is born from contradiction. For Hegel, knowledge isn't a straight line. It's not about collecting facts or stacking up certainties. It's a living, dynamic, tense process. A dialectical movement where every idea contains the seed of its own negation, and every negation prepares the way for something greater. This process is called Aufhebung, a German word that's hard to translate directly, but carries the meaning of cancelling, preserving, and elevating all at once. Hegel's dialectic is more than just a clash of opposites. It's an inner struggle for truth, where real understanding only comes through crisis, conflict, and growth. And yes, it hurts. Because for Hegel, knowing yourself means walking through a path of contradictions. There's no self-knowledge without conflict. No real growth without denying parts of who you thought you were. Consciousness forms by clashing with others, with the world, and with itself. And at every stage, what once felt solid falls apart. What once felt like your identity gets revealed as illusion. What once seemed like the final answer becomes just another temporary step. That pain is part of the process, because knowledge isn't something handed to you. It's earned, and every gain comes with a loss. You have to let go of who you were in order to become who you're meant to be. Hegel once wrote, "The soul must go through the labor of the negative. Patience with the negative is the strength of spirit. That patience, with pain, with doubt, with contradiction, is what defines real thought. A spirit that doesn't want to just repeat what it's told, but truly understand, must be willing to hold the tension between what is and what could be, between the finite and the infinite, between self and other." The dialectical struggle is, at its core, an internal drama, a drama of the self trying to know itself, only to split apart, trying to stand firm, only to fall, trying to grow, only to transform. That's why Hegel describes knowledge as a twisted, difficult path. It starts with alienation, with illusion, with the denial of self. At first, consciousness thinks it holds the truth, but little by little, it realizes that truth was incomplete, that what seemed absolute was only partial, that what seemed like me was just a shallow construction. That realization causes a crisis, and that crisis is essential. It's where true knowledge begins, because only those willing to challenge their own certainties can reach something deeper. But it takes courage, because overcoming yourself is hard. Most people cling to what they already know. They hold tight to their own views, their version of reality. They avoid conflict, dodge contradiction, and run from hard questions. But for Hegel, that's not growth, that's stagnation. A spirit that never moves, never challenges itself, never opens to the other, stays stuck. Hegel's dialectic tells us, you have to lose yourself to find yourself. You have to go through a kind of symbolic death, letting go of who you thought you were, so that your true self can emerge. And that death isn't gentle. It's painful, disorienting, and confusing, but it's also freeing. In his work, The Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel maps out this journey of consciousness, from the most basic kind of knowing, like sense certainty, to absolute knowing. And at every stage, the mind realizes its view of the world is limited, conflicted, fragile. It has to die to that version to be reborn into one that's more complex and rich. It's like climbing an endless staircase of self-awareness. With every step, something inside us breaks. A mask falls off, a belief collapses, an attachment fades, and at the same time, something new forms, truer, deeper, stronger. But Hegel isn't just talking about personal growth. He also sees this process happening in history. All of humanity is going through a dialectical process, ideas, institutions, ethical systems. Everything evolves through contradiction and conflict. Feudalism rejected the ancient world. Modernity rejected feudalism. Modern democracy rejected absolutism. And with each rejection, something is left behind. But something is also carried forward and raised to a higher level. So, the dialectical struggle is the engine of history and of self-awareness. And it's never peaceful. It's full of clashes, disruptions, and confrontations. It means realizing that the other is essential to who I am, that I can only truly see myself when I see my reflection in someone else, when I allow what's different to shape me. That's a tough lesson, because the other forces me out of my comfort zone. It forces me to rethink my ideas. It forces me to admit that my truth isn't the whole truth, that becoming conscious means making space for what challenges me. That's why, in Hegel's view, knowledge is always a fight, not a destructive fight, but a fight that transforms, a productive tension between who I am now and who I could become, between form and becoming, between limitation and freedom. Real knowledge is never comfortable. It demands we go through the negative, face the contradiction, accept that growth is painful, but necessary. The spirit must break, must get lost, must say no to itself. And in that process, it suffers. But through that suffering, it comes to know itself. So the pain, it's not the end, it's the passage. It's proof that something inside us is shifting, that consciousness is expanding, that knowledge isn't something we own, it's something we move through. And the person who truly knows themselves is the one who rebuilds themselves again and again through every contradiction. In the end, Hegel shows us that real knowledge is a living, messy, deeply human process. A journey where we're not chasing perfect answers. We're constantly reconciling the many versions of ourselves. And that reconciliation is only possible because we suffer, because we dare to let go, because we're willing to sit in the space between certainties, because we go through the labor of the negative with patience, humility, and openness. For Hegel, true knowledge isn't an answer. It's a struggle that begins within and never really ends. In a world that still believes progress will save us, Theodor W. Adorno emerges as a harsh but essential voice. His philosophy is dense, critical, and deeply disturbing. He forces us to confront a wound many would rather ignore. Modernity didn't make us more humane. It just gave us more refined tools of destruction. Adorno was deeply shaped by the tragedies of the 20th century. As a Jewish German exile, he witnessed the horrors of Nazism, the collapse of Enlightenment ideals, and genocide conducted with brutal efficiency. He saw firsthand what happens when rationality divorces ethics, when technical knowledge becomes a tool for barbarism. For him, true knowledge doesn't comfort, it indicts. A member of the Frankfurt School, Adorno challenged the idea that reason is inherently freeing. He showed how modern rationality, when turned into a means, can turn people into numbers, lives into data, and human bodies into disposable objects. Barbarism is not the opposite of civilization. It is a product of it. Dialectic of Enlightenment, with Max Horkheimer. This critique is central. The Enlightenment that promised freedom actually created new forms of domination. Science, technology, logic, tools meant to humanize us, ended up reinforcing oppression. Auschwitz, Adorno argued, was not a historical accident. It was the terrible consequence of reason stripped of humanity, a cold, systematic project, efficient, bureaucratic, utterly monstrous. Understanding this isn't just intellectual, it means carrying an undying grief. So in Adorno's view, real knowledge hurts because it demands we face collective suffering, not as something distant or behind us, but as a wound still open in our society. He once said we can't write poetry after Auschwitz, not because art is dead, but because every form of expression post-horror must carry that pain. Any attempt at beauty must acknowledge this trauma. Otherwise, it becomes alienation, cynicism, or forgetting. This ethical stance runs through all his work. Thinking is a historic responsibility. It means not just understanding the world, but listening to voices that were silenced. True knowledge must, therefore, be memorial. It lays bare what progress tried to bury. What makes this so unsettling is realizing that barbarism isn't a deviation. It's built into civilization's logic, and realizing that we all participate in it, even unknowingly. We consume goods made by exploited labor. We live surrounded by normalized inequality. We repeat language that excludes and devalues. Adorno asks us to embrace a clarity that doesn't let us sleep peacefully. He said modern life is defined by alienation, standardization, and objectifying human beings as roles, relations, and even emotions. His famous critique of the culture industry isn't an attack on culture itself, but on how it's become a commodity. What should provoke thought now primarily entertains, sells, or distracts us. Music is mass-produced. Movies follow formulas. Critical thinking gets replaced with slogans. Culture has become an industry. The new thing is that this industry presents as culture. The culture industry, enlightenment as mass deception. This culture lulls us from our pain. It distracts us from misery, loneliness, structural violence. It invites us to smile while the world burns. And worst of all, it convinces us we're free when we're actually more complacent. That's why, for Adorno, knowledge must swim against the current. It must recall, provoke, and disturb. It's not about absolute truth, but about revealing convenient lies, unmasking silences, uncovering distortions. Knowledge, then, isn't comfort. It's a call to action. A call to think differently, feel differently, remember. A call that hurts because it tells us the suffering of the past hasn't ended. It persists in our institutions, habits, and systems. Adorno believed philosophy must not be complicit in silence. It must bear collective pain, not to stop us, but to keep us alert. Resistance, then, isn't loud revolution. It's keeping critical awareness alive. It's refusing to forget. It's refusing to adapt to injustice. It's keeping empathy alive, no matter how normalized cruelty has become. But this stance has a cost. Critical knowledge isolates. It pulls you out of comfort zones. It forces you to carry clarity's weight in a world that prefers numbness. Adorno knew real awareness is lonely, bitter, demanding, but also perhaps the only possible dignity. He didn't believe in easy redemption, but he also refused nihilism. His is a philosophy of active sorrow, an ethical melancholy that transforms pain into vigilance, a commitment to those who have suffered and those still suffering. Adorno said all thinking should begin from suffering, not as pessimism, but to stay awake, because past horrors only stay buried if we constantly remember and critique them. In that way, knowledge fulfills its noblest function, ensuring we don't forget, keeping memory alive, exposing what history tried to erase, and building paths not yet taken, paths where reason and sensitivity walk together, without one destroying the other. Modern rationality failed, but giving up on thinking is not the answer. We must think better, with care, empathy, ethics, with the weight of historical suffering behind us, not to be crushed, but not forgotten either. Ultimately, Adorno teaches us that to know is to remember, and to remember is, too often, an act of silent resistance, a way to keep human dignity alive in a world that constantly threatens to lose it. Few phrases in the history of philosophy have made people as uncomfortable as this one. Hell is other people. This sentence, written by Jean-Paul Sartre in his 1944 play No Exit, Was Clos, is often misunderstood. It doesn't mean that being around others is always unbearable, or that isolation is the only way to find peace. What Sartre really shows us is that human relationships, in their deepest truth, are filled with tension, conflict, and exposure. They're like uncomfortable mirrors, where we can't hide, not even from ourselves. To understand the depth of this statement, we need to dive into Sartre's existentialist philosophy. As we've seen in his idea that freedom is a condemnation, Sartre believes that humans are radically free. There's no fixed essence given to us by God, biology, or society. We are what we make of ourselves. We're always a work in progress. But that freedom doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's constantly challenged, especially by the gaze of others. The other person isn't just some neutral presence in the world. They see me, and by seeing me, they reveal me. They turn me into an object. They take away my illusion of control. When I'm alone, I can believe I'm whoever I want to be. But in front of someone else, I become what they see in me, and I can't stop it. That's why Sartre says the other person is the one who looks at me and judges me. Through their gaze, I'm pulled out of my pure freedom and thrown into an invisible kind of prison. I have to constantly negotiate my image, my identity, and my freedom with theirs. The gaze of the other objectifies me, it pins me down, it reduces me. Being and nothingness. That gaze doesn't even have to be cruel. It could be kind, and still, it defines me in a way I can't control. And here's the first source of anxiety. I never fully own my image. I'm always being interpreted, labeled, compared, and that hurts more than we admit. This existential anxiety doesn't just come from others. It also comes from within. Because the moment I realize I'm free and fully responsible for my choices, I have to face everything I am with no excuses. I can't blame fate, genetics, or my environment. Every choice reflects my freedom, and that's terrifying. Hell, then, isn't just other people judging me. It's also me, seeing myself through their eyes. It's the trap of never escaping the awareness of my existence. Knowing I'm free, but that this freedom is exposed, vulnerable, fragile. Sartre's play, No Exit, shows this brilliantly. 3 characters locked in a room. No mirrors, no windows, just each other. There's no fire, no demons. The punishment is existential, being stuck under each other's gaze forever. That's what makes living with others so hard. We want to be loved, understood, accepted, but we also want to be free, authentic, independent, and those desires constantly clash. To be accepted, we have to mold ourselves, but in doing that, we betray parts of who we are. And if we try to be fully authentic, we risk rejection, misunderstanding, or judgment. We live in constant tension between being for ourselves and being for others, between our inner freedom and the image we project, or the one forced onto us. That tension is unavoidable, and it hurts, because it shows that freedom is never complete. It's always lived in friction with others. Sartre doesn't offer comfort here. He simply lays out the raw truth. To be human is to be condemned to freedom and to living with others. But there's something deeper. Living with others also reveals our own masks. We're not just victims of the gaze. We're also the ones looking. We judge, label, interpret people all the time. And in doing so, we often reduce them to caricatures, projections of our own fears or desires. Hell is other people, yes, but we're also someone else's hell. We're mirrors in which others see themselves, and not always clearly or with kindness. That realization brings a different kind of clarity, the awareness that we carry the same contradictions inside us that hurt when they come from others. This realization can break us or humanize us. It can push us into bitterness and isolation, or awaken a radical empathy, the understanding that everyone lives under the same conflict, wanting to be free and loved at the same time. We want recognition, but it limits us. We want to belong, but that comes with a price. Sartre doesn't give us an easy way out. He doesn't offer an escape or a perfect utopia. What he gives us is the raw truth of human existence. We are free, but that freedom is painful. We live together, But that togetherness is messy, tense, and complicated. And yet, it's all we've got. The answer isn't to run away from others or give up our freedom. Maybe the answer is to face the tension, to admit that living with others is hard because we're all cracked mirrors, reflecting each other with flaws, with judgments, with incompleteness. And yet, we need each other to become who we are, because it's in the gaze of the other that we realize we exist. It's in the discomfort of being together that we become aware. It's in the friction between freedom and responsibility, between authenticity and acceptance, that life becomes real. Hell is other people, yes, but they're also our only chance to step outside ourselves, to see beyond our bubble, to find, maybe, in the middle of all the tension, a space for love, for listening, for care. And for Sartre, that already means a lot, because living with clarity, even when it hurts, is the most honest act of freedom. Many people imagine enlightenment as some kind of mystical bliss, a permanent peace, or a heavenly sense of joy. But in Zen Buddhism, enlightenment, or satori, rarely comes with soft music and a peaceful sunset. Quite the opposite. It's often described as an existential shock, a sudden collapse of what we thought was real. Because in Zen, awakening means realizing the self isn't what we believed it to be. Zen practice takes us straight into the heart of a paradox. We search for a deep understanding of reality, but the closer we get, the more everything we relied on, our ideas, beliefs, identities, mental categories, begins to fall apart. This collapse happens because awakening reveals emptiness, the central concept in Mahayana Buddhism, known in Sanskrit as shunyata. But what is emptiness? It's not nothingness, like some kind of black hole or existential void. Emptiness means that nothing has an inherent fixed existence. No object, no thought, no feeling, no self is solid, permanent, or independent. Everything is interconnected, in constant flow. Everything is impermanent. And realizing this isn't just an intellectual understanding. It's something you feel, in your body, your mind, your soul. And when that realization hits you all at once, as it often does in Zen, the experience can be both liberating and deeply disorienting. Because in the moment of satori, the ego loses the ground beneath its feet. Zen doesn't offer crutches. It doesn't build a new spiritual identity to replace the old one. It doesn't say, you'll become a better version of yourself. It says, in sharp silence, there is no self. The you that believed it was separate and solid never really existed. It was a construction, useful maybe, but still an illusion. And when that illusion falls apart, something in us dies. That's why Zen masters often say enlightenment is like dying before you die. Because the ego, that structure we've spent our whole lives building, defending, and protecting, dissolves. And what's left, at first, is emptiness. But this emptiness isn't meaningless. It's a space with no center, yet full of presence. A state where everything simply is, no labels, no judgment, no separation between observer and observed. Still, that kind of state doesn't sit well with the ordinary mind. Our brains are wired to control, compare, label, organize. Suddenly, we're face to face with a reality that can't be grasped, where all concepts break down, where there's no inside or outside, no me or other, only this, here, now. And that's why enlightenment can be incredibly destabilizing. Zen calls it destroying the house of the mind, a metaphor for the collapse of the mental frameworks we use to make sense of the world. Emotions lose their familiar shape. Thoughts dissolve before they're finished. Time stops feeling linear, and our sense of identity begins to break apart. That can be terrifying for many. There are stories of practitioners who, after experiencing true satori, went through deep confusion, long silences, or periods of isolation, because the ego, which once organized everything, is no longer in charge, but it doesn't vanish entirely either. It's left exposed, unarmed, vulnerable. Zen doesn't romanticize this. It knows the ego is stubborn. Even after glimpsing emptiness, the ego might come back in disguise as the spiritual ego, the one that feels proud of being enlightened. That's why the Zen path requires discipline, awareness, and consistency. Because real enlightenment isn't a one-time event. It's something that must be lived and embodied in everyday life. And that might be Zen's deepest lesson. Enlightenment isn't an escape from life. It's diving fully into it. Shunryu Suzuki, one of the most influential Zen teachers in the West, put it like this: before enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. Nothing changes and everything changes. Because now, what was once done with a separate self is done in wholeness. The simplest action becomes an expression of the whole. Breathing becomes the universe breathing. The other is no longer someone separate. They're part of the same fabric. But to live like this, the ego has to let go, and it resists. It tries to rebuild its walls. It wants to understand, to control, to reclaim lost ground. But Zen keeps saying, there's nothing to hold on to. There's no final answer, no master to idolize, no salvation outside of your own clear, silent presence. The koan, a common Zen practice, reflects this collapse of mental categories. These are paradoxical questions with no logical answer, meant to break the mind open. They force the practitioner to let go of reason and enter direct experience. A classic example: what's the sound of one hand clapping? It's not meant to be answered with logic. It's meant to break you from the inside until the answer comes from a place beyond thought. Until the ego, exhausted from trying to understand, finally disappears. And only then, something real can arise. Zen is, in that sense, a hard path. It doesn't offer comforting stories. It doesn't promise happiness. It doesn't say everything will be okay. What it offers is reality, raw, direct, unfiltered. And facing that takes maturity, surrender, and courage. Enlightenment shakes the ego because the ego can't survive what's real. But this collapse isn't a tragedy. It's a release. Because when the ego falls, what's left is life in its fullness. No center, no separation, no need to understand, just to be. And that, even if it scares us, is what we most deeply long for. Imagine losing everything: your family, your home, your freedom, even your name, being reduced to a number, being dehumanized day after day until you forget who you used to be. That was the reality Viktor Frankl lived, an Austrian psychiatrist and survivor of the Nazi concentration camps. And yet, it was from within this hell that Frankl gave us one of the most powerful ideas in existential philosophy and depth psychology. Human beings can endure any suffering, as long as it has meaning. This isn't just a metaphor, it's a testimony. In his most famous book, Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl shares what he experienced in Auschwitz and other camps. But more than just describing horrors, he analyzes, with startling clarity, what helped some survive while others gave up. It wasn't physical strength, it wasn't health, it was meaning. Those who found some sense of purpose, a reason to keep going, even through unimaginable pain, had a better chance of holding on. A child waiting on the outside, a manuscript waiting to be rewritten, a promise made to oneself. Tiny flames that, even surrounded by darkness, kept the heart alive. But Frankl discovered something deeper. Humans need meaning just as much as they need bread. Without it, we break. We lose direction, motivation, and the will to endure. Suffering without a why becomes despair. And despair, he said, is the true collapse of the soul. Frankl went on to develop logotherapy, a therapeutic approach centered on the search for meaning. But his message went beyond therapy. It was an existential call, a reminder that even when we can't control what happens to us, we still have the freedom to choose how we respond. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, man's search for meaning. This idea is incredibly powerful and at the same time deeply demanding, because it means that even in the face of unbearable pain, we are responsible for the meaning we give it. It doesn't come from outside. It's not handed to us. It must be built, chosen, carried, even when everything around us says otherwise. But what happens when we search for meaning and nothing shows up? That's the most painful part of Frankl's philosophy, because if suffering demands meaning, then the absence of meaning makes the pain even worse. And that absence can be devastating. There are moments in life when we expect suffering to lead somewhere, through loss, failure, illness, or crisis. We hope the pain will teach us something, change us, point us in a new direction. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's just silence, and it's in that emptiness that many fall apart. Because pain without meaning is unbearable. It doesn't build, it destroys. It doesn't teach, it tears us down. Frankl doesn't deny this possibility. He offers no guarantees. He doesn't claim that every pain carries a hidden message. What he says is, even when we don't find meaning, we can still choose it. We can create it, affirm it, invent it, even in the middle of the absurd. That's not easy. It takes deep existential maturity. It's not about sugarcoating life. It's about choosing to affirm life, in spite of it. Life is never made unbearable by circumstances, but only by lack of meaning and purpose. The human search for meaning. The greatness of Frankl's thought lies in not romanticizing pain, but also not running from it. He never says suffering is good. He doesn't glorify it. What he says is, if we can't avoid suffering, then at least let us respond to it. And that response is always unique, personal, non-transferable. For some, meaning might come from faith. For others, from art, from love, from work, from caring for someone. Frankl believed that life is constantly asking us something, and it's up to each person to answer. There is no right answer, only the honesty of the search. But the search itself is painful, because it means facing the void, admitting that we often have no idea why we're suffering. Walking through the dark, guided only by the will not to give up. That's why Frankl spoke of the courage to live. A quiet courage, one that doesn't rely on promises, that doesn't expect rewards, but that insists, perseveres, keeps going. In the camps, he saw people die not because they were weaker, but because they lost their why, the hope of seeing someone again, of finishing something, of making sense of it all. When that hope vanished, the soul gave in, and the body followed. But he also saw the opposite. People who, even facing certain death, chose to stand, to comfort others, to resist. Not out of optimism, but as a radical act of human dignity. That dignity is what Frankl pulled from the mud, the cold, the hate. His philosophy is, above all, a response to hopelessness. But it's not an easy one, because it demands that we take ownership of our suffering, that we give it meaning, ourselves. And that may be the hardest thing of all, because it's easier to pass that burden on, to wait for pain to come with a user manual. But life, as Frankl reminds us, doesn't work like that. It throws us into absurd, unfair, random situations and dares us to respond, dares us to make pain a beginning, not an end. In the end, Frankl teaches us that suffering doesn't have to be the final chapter. It can be the soil where something new is born, a new ethic, a new strength, a new kind of courage. But that only happens when we accept the task, the hard, honest, intimate task of finding or creating meaning, even when nothing makes sense, especially then. In times of moral noise, where values get blurred and ethics are often treated as optional, Confucius still stands as a calm, steady voice, reminding us of something essential. Real knowledge comes with responsibility. More than a philosopher, Confucius was a teacher of practical living. He lived through a period of political and moral collapse in ancient China, and clearly saw that the world's biggest problem wasn't just ignorance, it was the lack of virtue in those who did know better. For Confucius, it's not enough to know what's right, you have to live it. And when someone knows the right thing but chooses not to act, a silent, deep and lasting pain begins, moral suffering. This pain doesn't come from outside, not from punishment or judgment. It comes from within. It's the inner conflict between what we know and what we do. And the wiser someone becomes, the more this gap hurts, because knowledge does shine a light, but it also makes us accountable. True wisdom, according to Confucius, isn't about academic knowledge or intellectual status. It shows up in character, in action, in doing what's right when it's hard. In Confucianism, knowing isn't an end in itself. It's a commitment to doing good. To know what is right and not do it is a lack of courage. Analects, Book 2. This simple line carries a heavy weight. It shows that knowledge isn't neutral. It demands something from us. It's not just about collecting facts. It's about the duty to act with awareness, to reject ethical cowardice, to understand that wisdom takes courage. And this courage isn't flashy or heroic. It shows up in the small things. Doing what's fair in the face of injustice. Speaking the truth when silence would be easier. Choosing what's right even when no one's watching. But living this way isn't easy, because as Confucius knew well, the world often rewards cleverness, not virtue. The corrupt get ahead. The honest are mocked. The cowardly stay safe. The righteous get pushed aside. Here lies the most painful tension of wisdom. Doing the right thing in a broken world will always come with suffering. The wise suffer not because they're clueless, but because they see too clearly. They spot what's wrong and feel the weight of not playing along. They know they could gain more by staying quiet, but they're unwilling to pay that price. They know they'd be more accepted if they looked the other way, but they choose integrity over comfort. This kind of suffering isn't destructive. It's dignified. It's the cost of living with integrity. Confucius believed the ethical path isn't just for saints or hermits. It's everyone's responsibility. And it begins at home, in relationships, in daily choices. His philosophy is deeply human. Anyone can be noble, if they act with humanity. The key word here is ren, often translated as kindness, humanity, or virtue. But ren is more than a trait. It's a way of being in the world. It means acting with empathy, respect, responsibility, and compassion. Putting yourself in someone else's shoes, not doing to others what you wouldn't want done to you. Do not impose on others what you do not wish for yourself. Moi. Analects, Book 15. This ethical principle, older than even the Western Golden Rule, shows how deeply moral responsibility is embedded in Confucian thought. And once we understand this, there's no more room for ethical laziness. Because knowledge doesn't let you off the hook. It demands, it calls you out, it holds you accountable. So what happens when we know the right thing and still don't do it? According to Confucius, our character weakens, our mind becomes restless, our soul gets out of sync. There's a quiet shame that pulls us away from ourselves. No matter how much we try to justify it, when we betray what we know is right, something inside us breaks. That's moral suffering. A wound that doesn't scream, but doesn't heal either. And the more wisdom we gain, the more that wound shows itself. Because ethical awareness is sensitive, and it demands alignment. Confucius also spoke about the power of example. He believed the world changes when those who know actually act. That real transformation happens from the inside out. A just leader can guide a nation. An ethical parent can shape a generation. An honest citizen can uplift a whole community. But for that, we need to live what we know. We need to align words with actions, knowledge with behavior, heart with conduct. Virtue does not live in those who only know how to talk. Analects, Book 14th. This is a powerful and necessary lesson in a time when talk often replaces action, when many know what's right, but stay silent, hide, or play it safe. Confucius reminds us that pretending not to know is a kind of betrayal, and silence in the face of injustice is still a choice. But here's the thing, moral suffering isn't punishment. It's a warning sign, a wake-up call, a push toward honesty, a chance to begin again. Because for Confucius, wisdom isn't about being perfect. It's about constantly striving to be better. We all mess up. We all fall short. But what separates the wise from the foolish is the will to grow, to act better tomorrow, to be more honest today than we were yesterday. Confucius didn't want saints. He wanted people committed to virtue, and that alone is revolutionary. Because in a world where so many know, but so few act, the true sage is the one who, even when hurting, even when tired, even when alone, still chooses what's right, and even when it hurts, they know. Nothing hurts more than betraying what you know is just. Humans may be the only animals that know we're going to die. And while that awareness sets us apart, it also quietly and persistently haunts us. Terror management theory, TMT, is built on a simple but unsettling idea. We live in fear of death, and will do almost anything to avoid facing it directly. Developed by psychologists Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Tom Pischinsky, TMT suggests that being aware of our own mortality creates deep existential anxiety. It's not just about the instinct to stay alive. It's about realizing that someday we will no longer exist, that everything we are, our memories, our achievements, our relationships, will eventually come to an end. This awareness, while a sign of intelligence, carries a heavy burden: the fear of meaninglessness. If everything ends, why begin at all? If death is certain, what truly matters? If nothing lasts, what's the point of trying? Most people avoid asking these questions directly, but they quietly shape nearly everything we do. And according to TMT, we respond to this anxiety by creating psychological shields, symbolic systems of protection. In other words, we turn to culture, religion, ideologies, myths, and stories to give our lives meaning and keep death anxiety at bay. Religion promises life after death. Culture honors heroes and legacies. Fame offers symbolic immortality. Work gives the feeling we'll leave something behind. Family carries our lineage. Even consumerism distracts us with the illusion that owning things can make up for our fading existence. These aren't lies. They're human responses to the abyss, ways of giving meaning to something that, by its nature, seems absurd. Living while knowing we're going to die. But TMT warns us, when those symbolic defenses are threatened, the fear comes rushing back. That's why we often react defensively when someone challenges our beliefs. Why we get uncomfortable talking about death. Why we cling to routines, habits, and certainties. Because without them, we're forced to face the truth. We are temporary, and that truth can paralyze us. Multiple studies based on TMT have shown that when people are subtly reminded of their mortality, a concept known as mortality salience, they tend to become more defensive, more rigid, and more attached to their worldview. They reject what's different. They cling harder to their cultural or religious beliefs. They judge others more harshly. It's like we're grasping for anything that makes us feel permanent when we're reminded that we're not. But there's a cost to all this. In trying to avoid death, we often avoid life too. We stay numb, too busy, too distracted, too afraid. We push away thoughts of death like they can't touch us. But deep down, we know. We know time is passing. We know nothing lasts. We know our turn will come. And the more we deny it, the more it shapes us behind the scenes. TMT isn't just abstract philosophy. It shows how this anxiety plays out in everyday life, from the fear of aging to the obsession with success and recognition, from chasing relationships that feel permanent to building strong social identities. All of it, in some way, may be an attempt to avoid falling apart in the face of death. But what if we stopped running? What if, instead of fearing death, we turned toward it? Not with darkness, but with awareness. Not with despair, but with clarity. Some thinkers, like existential philosopher Martin Heidegger, believed that living authentically means living with death in mind. That by accepting our limits, we can focus on what really matters. We stop delaying, stop lying to ourselves, stop chasing distractions. TMT recognizes this too, but says it's not easy. Constant awareness of death can lead to paralysis, to a sense of futility, chronic anxiety, depression, or nihilism. Because how do you live fully knowing that everything ends? And that's the paradox. We have to forget about death to live, but we also have to remember it to live truthfully. The line between a life frozen by fear and a life awakened by mortality is razor thin. So the idea isn't to obsess over the end, but to accept that it's real. And that's exactly why life matters. The shift in perspective can be powerful. Knowing we'll die can free us from the meaningless. It can push us to speak our truth, forgive, take risks, create. It can remind us that time isn't unlimited, so every moment counts. But that only happens if we stop running. When denied, death traps us. When faced, it sets us free. TMT doesn't try to offer comfort. It shows, based on real studies and data, that human life is built around a single truth. We know we'll die, and we constantly try to manage that knowledge. What we do with that awareness is the real challenge. We can build walls and live in fear, or we can use that awareness to build bridges between who we are and who we could become. Because in the end, knowing we're going to die is exactly what gives us the chance to decide how we want to live. Few thinkers have gone as deeply into the pain of the world as Simone Weil. Philosopher, mystic, activist, and writer, her life and work were marked by a radical commitment to truth, especially the truth of human suffering. For Weil, real compassion isn't a noble gesture or a warm feeling. It's a demanding, almost violent act that wounds the soul. Because truly paying attention to someone else's suffering forces us to step outside of ourselves, to drop our defenses, let go of our certainties and desires, and face the raw vulnerability of a pain that isn't ours, but which, when fully seen, changes us forever. She once wrote, "Attention, taken to its highest degree, is the same thing as prayer, gravity and grace. But it's not a prayer to ask for something. It's a prayer of presence, a total surrender of the self to someone else's reality, without judgment, without analysis, without looking away. And that, according to Weil, is one of the hardest and most painful things a human being can do. We live in a world that constantly invites us to distraction. Even when suffering is visible, it's often ignored, turned into aesthetics, or turned into spectacle. Images flash by on TV, statistics spread online, stories reach us, and we become numb spectators. But Weil refuses that numbness. For her, real ethics begin when we actually look at the other and truly see them, not as a number, not as someone to pity, not as someone to be rescued, but as a real person in real pain who doesn't need a solution, but attention. That deep attention, which she compares to prayer, is quiet, humble, ego-free. It's the opposite of performative charity or heroic savior complexes. It's the act of simply being present with an open heart in front of something that cannot be fixed. And that presence, as simple as it sounds, hurts. It hurts because it pulls us out of our bubble. It hurts because it shows us how powerless we really are. It hurts because it puts us face to face with suffering we can't explain, justify, or erase. It's a kind of pain that doesn't come from shallow empathy, but from a spiritual understanding that suffering goes beyond the individual. We'll believe that the pain of others has sacred value, and the only way to honor that value is to let it affect us, without defending ourselves. That doesn't mean drowning in sadness or taking on guilt. It means being moved by something that shakes us, that makes us question our privileges, our priorities, our silence. In that sense, Simone Weil is uncompromising. It's not enough to feel sorry. You have to suffer with. It's not enough to be outraged. You have to be present. It's not enough to give. You have to become vulnerable. This moral intensity makes her thinking hard to accept and even harder to live, because it demands the suspension of the ego, the rejection of the idea that we are the center, that we have the answers, that we can fix everything. To love someone in their suffering, you must first quiet your own ego, and that by itself is already a form of pain. Simone Weil said that human suffering is the place where God is absent, and where, paradoxically, we can find him, not as a comforting presence, but as an aching absence, as an emptiness that invites real compassion. The love of God is silence. Suffering is silence. Attention is silence. Where there is silence, God is present, waiting for God. While spirituality isn't about promises of comfort, it's about an ethic of embodying suffering. For her, the crucified Christ is the ultimate symbol of attention. Not someone who saves with power, but someone who suffers with, suffers in, suffers for. A divinity that doesn't overpower, but surrenders to the silence of human pain. This vision forces us to rethink how we respond to the suffering of others, not as a problem to solve, but as a reality to inhabit. And that, as she insists, hurts, because it asks us not just for compassion, but for the courage to carry the weight of someone else's pain without trying to escape it. It asks us to be fully present, even when there's nothing we can do. Attention, in this way, is an act of love without control, without ego, without vanity. And that's why it's so rare. Simone Weil lived what she believed. She gave up privileges, worked in factories, fasted in solidarity with war victims, refused medical treatment to stay true to her moral conscience. She died young, at 34, physically weak, but spiritually clear like few others. Her life was proof of what she taught. Those who truly love, suffer. Not because they seek suffering, but because real love, silent, attentive love, opens us up to the world, and the world is hurting. By asking us to pay attention to the pain of others, Simone Weil invites us into a kind of clarity that hurts, but also purifies. A clarity that makes it impossible to ignore suffering anymore. A clarity that reminds us that human life only has dignity when we recognize the dignity of others, especially when they are down. Suffering cannot be ignored, dressed up, or explained away. It must be welcomed with an open heart and the courage to feel what it stirs in us. Because in the end, this is what makes us human. To see and not look away. To feel and not shut down. To suffer and still choose to love. Freedom is a cherished idea in human experience. From early on, we learn that we're authors of our choices, masters of our paths, creators of our destiny. But radical behaviorism, particularly through B.F. Skinner, casts a disturbing shadow on that belief. What if we aren't as free as we think we are? Radical behaviorism argues that our behavior is shaped by external factors, stimuli, rewards, punishments, context. In other words, what we think are free choices are often conditioned responses to environments and reinforcement histories. We're the product of a complex mix of biological, environmental, and social influences. This idea alone unsettles common sense. But when truly understood, something deeper emerges. A sense of lost autonomy, ownership, identity. It's as if the self is just an illusion of control, a puppet moved by invisible strings, unaware of who's pulling them. For many, that realization is emotionally jarring, because it's not just psychological theory, it's an existential wound. If our decisions are outcomes of prior reinforcement, where's freedom? If our tastes, habits, reactions, opinions, everything is conditioned. What's left of the self? In Beyond Freedom and Dignity, 1971, Skinner challenges traditional notions of autonomy and free will. To him, personal freedom is a myth, possibly useful, but still an illusion. Behavioral science doesn't need this idea to explain human actions. Instead, it shows behavior as a function of the environment, past and present. Freedom is a concept antecedent to understanding the causes of behavior. Beyond Freedom and Dignity, this statement, while scientifically grounded, is existentially devastating. It implies that traditional human dignity, rooted in morally free agency, needs rethinking. For many, that sounds like a direct attack on individual value. How can one accept that what feels intimate, our choices, values, decisions, is actually shaped by invisible conditioning? The initial reaction to this awareness is often despair. We confront the possibility that we are determined, not by a deity or destiny, but by mundane variables like social approval, family expectations, childhood traumas, or consumer trends. Radical behaviorism makes it clear there is no hidden self pulling the strings, no soul, no autonomously free core, only observable behavior, reinforcement patterns, and learning histories. Everything we do, from writing poetry to committing crimes, can be explained through environment and consequences. While this explanation is impressively precise, it robs us of something we once considered essential, the feeling of being free. And that cuts deeply. It hurts because it strips us of our self-agency. It hurts because it forces us to admit that much of what we call will is actually habit. What we believe are choices are reinforcement patterns. What seems like personality traits are just learned responses to specific settings. This kind of clarity isn't neutral. It destabilizes us. It demands a new way of understanding ourselves. And for many, it's too much. The pain of realizing we're conditioned can lead to emptiness, alienation, rebellion. How can we keep a sense of responsibility if everything is externally determined? How can we truly love if love is just positive reinforcement? How can we create if every choice was already shaped by the environment? This existential crisis isn't a flaw in the theory, it's its most honest outcome. Skinner didn't deny ethics or social solutions, but he viewed them functionally. If we want better societies, we should tweak environments to encourage ethical, cooperative, creative behavior, not appeal to free will, which may be illusory. That approach is pragmatic, but impersonal. It removes personal merit, the glory of choice, the weight of guilt. It treats humans as consequence-sensitive organisms, not heroic spirits, and that scientific detachment is unnerving. Yet there's another way to see it. Instead of feeling diminished, we can view the theory as a chance to deeply understand our motivations. Knowing we were shaped doesn't mean we're condemned. It means we can reshape ourselves. We can act back on the environments that act on us. We can build contexts that nurture more conscious, ethical, humane behavior. Radical behaviorism may reject metaphysical free will, but it does not reject change. Quite the opposite. It's optimistic about our capacity for transformation, but it requires giving up the myth of an untouchable self. Accepting that we are plastic, that we are history, that we are both consequence and possibility. Yes, recognizing that we're shaped hurts, but it can be the first step toward consciously choosing what supports our existence. It can be the beginning of liberation, not from causality, but from ignorance. Because knowing we are shaped doesn't trap us. It invites us to build better contexts. It invites us to become, together, conscious sculptors of ourselves. There's something unsettling about understanding people too well. Knowing how the mind works, its cracks, its weaknesses, can be enlightening, but also deeply disturbing. That's what dark psychology reveals. A deep knowledge of the human psyche doesn't just bring clarity, it also haunts you. While most areas of psychology aim to promote well-being, mental health, and personal growth, dark psychology looks in another direction, toward the parts of the mind many prefer to ignore, the manipulative, controlling, seductive, and destructive sides. It studies techniques of psychological influence, social domination, coercive persuasion, lying, emotional blackmail, gaslighting, and brainwashing. Not to encourage them, but to understand them. And by understanding, realize just how vulnerable we really are. And that realization isn't easy, because it begins by admitting something that hurts our pride. We're not as rational, independent, or self-aware as we think. We're driven by emotion, insecurity, the need to belong, the desire for approval. We want to be liked, admired, loved, and so we let our guard down, often without even noticing. We're more suggestible than we admit, more influenceable, more predictable, and dark psychology shows how easily those weaknesses can be exploited. Studying manipulation is like walking through a minefield. There are subtle ways to control people through language. There are methods to create guilt, fear, desire. There are strategies that hijack your attention, twist your perception, and weaken your will. Marketing, advertising, political speeches, toxic relationships. All of these can carry elements of this psychological engineering. And once you start studying it, you begin to realize you're surrounded by stimuli designed to seduce, lead, and shape you. But even worse, you realize that you are capable of manipulating too. That's perhaps the most uncomfortable part. Dark psychology doesn't just expose others, it exposes us. It shows that the potential to manipulate lives inside all of us. That we all carry seeds of control, domination, selfish persuasion. Even if we never use them, just knowing we could is heavy. It's like holding a weapon and realizing you have the power to hurt, and that many people do. That awareness is disturbing. It shakes the idea that humans are naturally good or trustworthy. It shows that our moral self might just be a fragile mask, and that given the right circumstances, we could easily cross ethical lines. Milgram's famous experiment, where people delivered what they believed were painful shocks just because an authority told them to, is a perfect example. It showed that blind obedience can be triggered surprisingly easily. That morality often collapses under social pressure. Studying these dynamics creates a unique kind of suffering, the pain of awareness, the pain of realizing we've been manipulated, but also that we've manipulated others, that we've been victims, but also potential perpetrators, that we're not protected, we're exposed. This pain wounds the ego, especially for those who believe they're in control of their own minds and decisions. Dark psychology forces us to see we're not invincible, that even the smartest, most well-meaning people can be deceived. And worse, that deception can be pleasant, seductive, comforting. Manipulation is rarely obvious. It's charming, gradual, adaptive. It works because it looks like care, protection, truth, and that's what makes it so dangerous. But even though this realization hurts, it can also set us free. Because when we recognize our vulnerabilities, we can start protecting them. We can develop awareness, self-knowledge, and critical thinking. We can learn to say no, to be cautious of things that feel too good, to spot toxic patterns, to tell when a compliment is bait, when an argument is a trap, when a kind gesture hides a need to control. Dark psychology, when studied ethically and responsibly, isn't a weapon. It's a shield. It doesn't exist to create manipulators. It exists to create awareness. And that awareness, clear, skeptical, honest, hurts. Because it demands maturity to accept that the world isn't as innocent as we'd like to believe. And that the human mind, for all its beauty, also holds shadows. Carl Jung warned, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Dark psychology touches that unconscious. It shows us the hidden forces driving us, and how dangerous it is to ignore them. It shows how easily they can be used against us by those who understand them. The suffering that comes with this knowledge isn't weakness. It's the echo of responsibility. The pain of realizing that now we know, we can't pretend we don't. Because knowledge demands vigilance. And vigilance demands constant effort. Living with a critical mind is exhausting. It's easier to trust blindly, follow the crowd, accept what we're told. But that easy path leaves us vulnerable. Knowing how to manipulate also means knowing how to defend yourself, knowing how to resist, how to recognize hidden intentions. But more importantly, it means knowing when not to use that power. Because real ethics isn't just about avoiding manipulation. It's about refusing to become the manipulator. In that sense, dark psychology is an uncomfortable mirror. It shows what we're capable of doing and what we're willing to let others do to us. And it asks us, what will you do with this knowledge? To ignore it is to stay vulnerable. To use it to control others is to betray your ethics. But to know it and act with integrity, that's the path to awareness, and maybe to real freedom. And if you made it this far, it means you're looking for more than just easy answers. You're here to reflect, to question, to feel. And that alone is an act of courage. Throughout this journey, we explored the pain and clarity of those who dared to think deeply. From Socrates to Simone Weil, from Nietzsche to Viktor Frankl, they all showed us that understanding too much can hurt, but it can also set us free, because real knowledge demands confrontation. It tears down illusions, but it also gives us the chance to live with more truth, more awareness, more humanity. If this touched you in any way, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with someone who needs to hear these ideas. Like the video to help this message reach more people. And leave a comment down below. Which of these lessons hit you the hardest? Which one sparked something in you? Which one made you uncomfortable or gave you peace? Make sure to subscribe to the channel. This is only a small part of everything we're still going to explore together. There's much more philosophy, psychology, and reflection on the way, and you're a part of it. So stick around, turn on the notifications, and stay with us. The next question might be the one that flips a switch inside you. See you in the next video. And remember, thinking hurts, but not thinking hurts even more.